1972, Dinky decided to do the desert version of the Bf-109. I believe that they were trying to represent Hans Marseille, the highest scoring ace up to that time, and he was born on the 13th of December 1919 and died on the 30th of September 1942. I believe that we can rectify that and do the correct colour scheme in this video. What to do if your motor is not working? Well, first of all, check your power supply. You need 1.5 volts DC. Check that it's there. If you have a meter, this is the best way to find out. Then turn the dial to the resistance. That's the one with the horseshoe. This means omega. Set it to the lowest setting on your meter. Then, using your probes, measure the resistance to the motor. If you have a resistance, which this does, that means that motor should by rights work. It's obviously not an electrical problem. So using the service or IPA 170, squirt this into the apertures in both sides of the motor. Let this get well into the armature and soak in. This is a electronics cleaner and lubricator. Wind it in, let it have a little bit of a soak, then use some 3-in-1 oil and a toothpick. Put the 3-in-1 oil, using a very small amount, on the tip of the cocktail stick. Then apply that small amount of oil to the bearing. This is the spindle that's sticking out of the motor, and let that lubricate that bearing. Turn on the power, give the propeller a flick, and hey presto, the motor will run. Let it all work its way in. Okay? Now that you have a working motor, you need to make sure that you have on the negative side, or the body of the motor has a soldered wire, cleanly soldered on and placed inside the Dinky toy. Run this wire back to the spring at the rear. The spring needs to be absolutely clean so that you can solder this wire into that spring. Best to use a wire out of a data cable. That's probably the best gauge to use for this. If you have an undercarriage that's hanging down and it won't snap back up properly into place, take apart the Dinky toy, and in the centre you will find a rivet. This rivet is not quite as tight as it could be, so get yourself a flat centre punch, a hot blower, a paint stripping machine, and a hammer. Then all you have to do is heat up the rivet, only for about 30 seconds. Use your flat punch and then tap down the rivet very, very, very gently with the hammer and the flat punch. Just give it a little few chances, and eventually that will tighten up and the wheel will just snap back into place. Put the whole thing back together and try it out again, and you'll find it'll work okay, just great. You will on occasion with your Dinky toys find that some panels will not fit correctly. Therefore you need to take them apart. Get yourself some leather gloves that have no plastic parts that can melt. Find yourself a paint stripping heat gun and heat up the part that needs to be adjusted. You don't need to get it red hot or anything like that, just quite warm. And now this will become very pliable. Do not under any circumstances do this when the metal is cold. Just gingerly ease the parts into the necessary position and then put them back together and do a trial fit. 9 times out of 10 you will find that this will actually work first time. Don't worry about it. The first part of the process is to remove the existing paint. Get yourself some caustic soda. This can normally be purchased either at the DIY store or more usually down at the pound shop. It's not very expensive at all. You can certainly afford to put a lot into the bowl. Make sure it's very hot water. This aids in the chemical process and speeds things up a little bit. Then don your washing up gloves, just to make sure you don't get any chemical burns or anything. And just take it out and have a look at your Dinky toy and make sure all the paint's removed. If there's anything left on there, just use a cocktail stick and scrape it off. Then buy some wire wool, usually a 000 grade used by French polishers. This is a very, very fine wire wool. and it's really great for getting all the oxidization off the metalwork without scratching it. It does actually polish it and will aid very much when you come to put on the etching primer. So you need to get your Dinky toy really nice and shiny. Don't skim with it. It takes about 40 minutes to do the whole thing in its entirety. Once you've deoxidized and polished up your Dinky toy, the next step is to put on an etching primer. This is very, very important because even though you may put on a fine primer, etching primer bites into the metal. Otherwise, your paintwork will flake off and just chip off. There's nothing you'll be able to do about it. So this just improves your chances of your final paintwork staying where it is. So next is the fine white primer. Using a white primer because we're using light colours, obviously blue and obviously tan. So there you go. Now you need to highlight the panels using masking tape. You can see here now where I've applied black paint to highlight all of the panels on the Dinky toy. This will help when putting on your base coat and your top coat. It will highlight the panels but not be so intrusive and become semi-invisible. Don't forget to fill in your wheel wells and all those odd points that you probably wouldn't think of immediately. And you can see here that it's important to get straight lines onto the fuselage. That's quite important. That's why I was using the tape earlier. So now I'm applying the base coat of the light blue using Tamiya. That's just the paint I happen to be using. It's something I'm used to using, so that's what I use. And you can see that right here that I'm applying it to the side of the fuselage, and I'll be going all around the underneath of the Dinky toy and covering the base coat in all areas. And now you can see that once the base coat has been applied, that the black lines start to disappear. They'll be totally gone from sight by the time the second coat goes on, which is what I'm doing now, and becomes semi-invisible. And this just adds to the panel line and make the Dinky toy just look that little bit more realistic. Take your time doing this. I'm using a Howie airbrush with a 0.2 needle with a 20 psi pressure on there. Now it's time to apply the Desert Yellow XF59 by Tamiya, which are the products that I tend to use mainly. And you can see that we're going over the top of the panel lines, which when the second coat is applied will be very, very faint indeed. Use blue tack and not tape to produce your straight lines, as this will not lift any paint up and it's easy to get off, and you don't want an exact straight line. This was never really happening because these things were painted in the desert, so you're never going to get a factory finished straight line. Now make sure that you don't forget to put the white ring around the nose. This is very convenient because when the bottom half goes on, it does actually give you a straight, nice white ring to apply to. Now to apply the yellow paint to the bottom of the cowling of the front of the engine compartment. This is also easy because the way that the model is put together, and therefore this is quite an easy process. Don't forget to apply your black paint for your exhaust stacks on both sides. This is really the best part to do it because there's nothing in there getting in your way. You're not going to make any mistakes, and this is one of the few times that I will actually pick up a brush rather than an airbrush. And now it's time for the canopy. I actually like to tape up the canopy. Several reasons. Number one, you can put many coats of paint on it, and you can put lacquer on it, and it doesn't make any difference. It comes out perfect every time. Don't forget to put your band on the tail there. This is 10mm wide. Now one of the important parts to take into consideration is that a desert aircraft has a different type of air intake to the Battle of Britain Messerschmitt. So I've taken off the air intake and drilled a 3mm hole right into the centre of it. This is not particularly easy to do, and therefore I'm using a hand drill rather than a battery drill or electric drill. Then I have some 3mm brass tubing which I managed to cut 10mm long, and with a lot of fiddling around you can get the brass part into the end of the original air intake, and then I just secure it with some super glue. Normally I don't use super glue, but I needed it to go off fairly quickly rather than having it moving around and everything else. But in the end it did go in. Not as pretty as I would have liked it, but you can't have everything in life. Now I've primed the air intake with some etching primer, which makes it a little bit more palatable to look at. And I just now, oh there we go, gets blown over. Bit of blue tack, push it down a bit harder, that's it. And you just get a bit of the desert paint there, and just paint the top half, let it go off, and then do the underneath blue, and you'll be all right with that. Now we're coming to one of the more interesting parts of the model, or the Dinky toy I should say, shading and colouring. Now I'm using some Faber-Castell chalks here, and obviously you can mix and match these. So using some bright yellow and a little bit of burnt ochre, you can actually mix these two together, and all you really need to do is just get yourself a very sharp blade, do a little bit of scraping off into a container, get yourself a brush and mix it together, and just dust it on to the panel lines, and you will see that the panel lines will become more highlighted. So you need a slightly darker effect around the edges and a lighter effect in the center of the panels. I would suggest in the center of the panels just using the yellow, and this will just bring up that little bit of depth of field on the Dinky toy, and it's really easy to do. There's no real skills involved. Just go around every panel in turn, just take your time, and even if there's a panel not shown on the Dinky toy, you can still highlight them. You just, you get a drawing off the internet, and it just show you where the panel lines are. Now when it comes to things like the gun ports, you want them to be a little bit darker and highlighted lighter around the gun ports, because this just brings the gun ports up without making it dead obvious. And then just use your airbrush to blow away any excess chalk dust. So it's now time to take off the masking tape. Obviously previously, as you can see, I've taken off the masking tape for the rudder, which I've painted in various shades of red to illustrate the ribs. I did just using the airbrush. It's my favourite method of doing just about everything in this planet, and rarely will you see me use an actual paintbrush. However, it did turn out okay in the end. Also, don't forget that you will need to put some white tips on the wings. Use 10mm Tamiya tape. 10mm seems to be the right size for just about everything on these Dinky toys, so I highly recommend that. The paint you can see in the cockpit, that's actually etching primer. It seems to be the right colour, so I just left it as it was and masked it up. And you can see also that the toning has come out quite well using the chalk. And now it's time to put a clear lacquer TS13 all over the Dinky toy, because this is now ready for the decals to go on. The clear gloss varnish will help the decals to go on and slide around and let them move around so you can get them into the right position. And furthermore, you want to protect the paint, because this paint will chip off quite readily if you do not protect it with the lacquer. I cannot stress that highly enough. So here we are, we've got the cockpit canopy on, we've got the motor in, the propellers on, and you can see the shadings come out quite well. There's the motor working. We're all ready to go for the decals, and obviously once the decals have been put on, we put a final coat of lacquer on. Obviously you have to remove the canopy again to do that, but this is just to show you how the paintwork is turned out and the motor's working. So now here we are, we're putting on the decals. Now we do need to really start with the tail end, and the reason being is that while you're handling the Dinky toy, you're least likely to pick it up from the tail and end up with the decals hanging off the end of your finger while you're trying to put other decals on at the same time. I have to tell myself off here because I'm using steel tweezers against the paintwork, and it's one of my no-nos, and I just lacked concentration there. The cotton bud is the correct way to do it and to soak up any moisture. Please note I'm not using any salt adhesives here. That is because they are a flat surface and you don't need to use a salt adhesive. Salt adhesives are really there if the surface is uneven, like rivets on a plastic model, for instance. So there's no real need to use them. But you really should use, and I highly recommend, the Asda cotton buds. They are extra thick and extra absorbent, and they're fantastic for moving your decals around. And now we are ready for the turntable. As you can see, all the decals are on now, and the propeller's turning, the air intake is fitted, and it's as it should be. I managed to get the decals from an Eastern European model 172 scale, and they're just gone on fantastic. The American ones which are available are twice the price, so it's just worth buying the kit and just using the decals as supplied.